In the high desert of Washington state, beyond the sagebrush and the Columbia River, stands a structure that doesn't look like a ruin. Four massive cooling towers rise against the sky like concrete giants. Reactor buildings sit half-finished. Miles of pipe that will never carry steam. It's beautiful in a brutal sort of way. But that's only the surface. Behind these walls lies a story of $24 billion spent. 20,000 workers hired and then abandoned. Promises of clean energy that became the largest municipal bond default in American history. Communities were built on hope, then betrayed. Lawsuits, bankruptcies, shattered lives. The dream was endless electricity. The reality? A concrete graveyard in the desert. Can ambition destroy you if it burns too bright? And the real question, who truly paid for the Washington Public Power Supply System nuclear plants? And what does that failure cost us today? If you're into deep investigations on America's industrial megaprojects and the people who built them, like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what abandoned project to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. Picture a spring morning, 1971. The Tri-Cities area of Washington state is baking under the high desert sun. Richland, Pasco, Kennewick. These are small towns that know nuclear power. They live right next to Hanford, the plutonium production site that helped end World War II and fueled the Cold War arsenal. This region understands atoms. They trust them. They've built their economy on them for 30 years. Now a new vision arrives, not for weapons, but for energy. Clean, limitless, cheap electricity that will power the Pacific Northwest for generations. The Washington Public Power Supply System, WPPSS, or WPS as the locals called it, a nickname that would become eerily prophetic, announces plans to build not one, not two, but 5 nuclear reactors simultaneously. The scale is unprecedented. No utility, public or private, has ever attempted this. 5 reactors, each capable of generating over 1,000 megawatts. Together, that's enough electricity to power every single home in Washington and Oregon combined. The man behind this vision wasn't a utility executive. He was a regional planner named J.J. Stein, working for the Bonneville Power Administration. Stein studied forecasts, and he saw that electricity demand in the Pacific Northwest was doubling every decade. The hydroelectric dams on the Columbia River, the backbone of the region's power, were maxed out. Every canyon worth damming already had a dam. The numbers pointed in one direction: nuclear. Stein wasn't a dreamer. He was a calculator. His projections showed demand hitting 50,000 megawatts by 1990. He assumed wrong. But back in 1971, the assumption felt like science. Every projection from every agency, federal, state, and private, showed the same curve climbing toward the sky. WPPSS was the instrument to meet that demand. It was a consortium of public utilities across Washington and Oregon, and it had built exactly one small reactor successfully before: the Hanford N reactor. That success bred confidence. If they could build one, they could build 5. The pitch to the public was seductive. Nuclear power would be too cheap to meter, a phrase that still echoed from the 1950s. Rates would drop, homes would stay warm, industries would flourish. The region would lead the nation into a clean energy future, and construction would create jobs, thousands of them. An army of skilled trades, electricians, welders, concrete workers, engineers, pipe fitters, and laborers would descend on the desert. The Tri-Cities prepared to boom. Construction started in 1972 on Washington Nuclear Plant 2 and 1. Yes, the numbering was confusing, and it matched the confusion to come. Sites were selected along the Columbia River for cooling water access. By 1974, plants 3, 4, and 5 were added. 5 reactors, 4 sites all at once. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what it takes to build a nuclear reactor. This isn't a coal plant. It's complexity incarnate. A single reactor requires about 2 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to build a highway from Seattle to Portland. The concrete has to be poured to tolerances measured in fractions of an inch, because it contains the radiation. One void, one crack, one weak point, and you have a catastrophe. Then there's the reactor vessel itself, a steel cylinder 40 feet tall with walls 8 inches thick, forged in one of the few specialized foundries in the world. Each one cost $50 million and took 2 years to make. Piping systems branch out like the circulatory system of a mechanical god. Miles of pipe, each weld x-rayed, each joint pressure tested. Electrical systems that would make an aerospace engineer weep. And every single component, every valve, every pump, every wire had to meet Nuclear Regulatory Commission standards that were constantly changing. Building one reactor is a feat. Building 5 at once is hubris, but the confidence was real. WPPSS hired Bechtel, one of the world's largest engineering firms. They had built reactors before. The question wasn't whether it could be done. The question, not asked loudly enough, was whether it should be done. They came from all over the country. Pipe fitters from Texas, iron workers from California, electricians from the Midwest. The unions sent their best. Wages were high. A skilled worker could make about $150,000 a year in today's money. They worked 60-hour weeks, bought houses, and brought their families. At the peak in 1981, over 20,000 workers were on site across the 5 projects. Shift changes looked like a factory town at quitting time. The work was hard and dangerous. Men fell from scaffolding. Heat stroke in the summer, frostbite in the winter. But the work was steady. The paychecks cleared. For skilled trades in an era when manufacturing was starting to leave America, this felt like security. But behind the scenes, problems were already accumulating. By 1976, the first plant was already behind schedule. 6 months became 12, then 18. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission kept changing the rules. Then, in 1979, 3 Mile Island happened. A partial meltdown in Pennsylvania terrified the nation. Overnight, safety standards tightened. A piping system installed in 1975 didn't meet 1977 standards. So they had to rip it out and reinstall it, jackhammering through concrete they had just poured. Costs climbed. The original budget for all 5 plants was $4 billion. By 1979, it was $10 billion. WPPSS went back to the bond market again and again, selling tax-free municipal bonds backed by the promise of future electricity revenues. The bonds seemed safe. The math seemed solid. But the math was changing. In 1973, the OPEC oil crisis hit. Americans started thinking about energy differently. Conservation became a thing. Electricity demand in the Pacific Northwest didn't double in the 70s. It barely grew at all. The aluminum smelters started shutting down. By 1980, the projections that justified 5 reactors looked absurd. The region didn't need 5,000 megawatts of new nuclear power. It might not need any, but WPPSS kept building. They had to. Stopping meant admitting failure. The politics were brutal. Utilities that had signed contracts started suing to get out. Inside WPPSS, management was paralyzed. Every decision required approval from 88 different member utilities. Meetings became shouting matches. Construction sites became chaos. In 1981, an internal audit leaked, revealing what everyone suspected. The projects were a disaster. Cost overruns were systemic. Schedules were fantasy. Plants 4 and 5 were so far behind they'd never be economical. The numbers were merciless. Every month of delay cost $50 million in interest alone. Finishing plants 4 and 5 would cost more than their electricity would ever be worth. On January 22, 1982, WPPSS voted to terminate construction on plants 4 and 5. The announcement said mothballed instead of canceled, promising they could be restarted if demand recovered. It was a lie. Everyone knew it. Workers showed up Monday morning to locked gates. No warning. 20,000 jobs became 0 jobs in a weekend. The trailer parks emptied. For sale signs appeared in front of houses that would never sell. The Tri-Cities unemployment rate hit 22%. Men who had relocated their families, who thought they had careers, now had nothing. Divorce rates spiked. Suicides followed. Foreclosures swept through neighborhoods. One worker, interviewed years later, said, "We built them a nuclear plant. They gave us a depression. The human cost doesn't show up in the official reports." WPPSS still owed bondholders $8.3 billion. Without plants 4 and 5 generating revenue, there was no way to pay. In July 1983, WPPSS defaulted. $2.25 billion in bonds became worthless overnight. It was the largest municipal bond default in American history, and that record still stands. Investors sued. Utilities sued each other. Ratepayers sued utilities. The litigation lasted over a decade. Washington's Supreme Court ruled that the contracts were invalid. The bondholders, pension funds, retirees, small investors who thought municipal bonds were safe lost everything. One retired teacher said in court, "They told us it was safe." They promised. The judge had no answer. Plants 1 and 3 were also terminated. 3 plants dead, billions spent. Nothing to show for it. Only WMP2 survived. It finally came online in 1984, 7 years late, and at triple the original budget. It was renamed the Columbia Generating Station to distance itself from the disaster, and it operates today as Washington's only nuclear plant. 1 reactor out of 5. At the abandoned sites, the structures remain. Cooling towers stand empty. Reactor buildings are sealed tombs. For years, security guards patrolled, keeping vandals out, maintaining the fiction that someday, maybe, they'd be restarted. They never were. Federal investigators eventually dissected what went wrong. The summary: management failure, forecasting failure, regulatory failure, engineering failure, and financial failure. But the report doesn't name villains. It describes a systemic failure. Everyone involved made what they thought were rational decisions. The system itself was flawed. No one went to jail. This wasn't fraud, it was hubris. So who paid? The workers paid with their jobs, careers, and communities. The bondholders paid with their pensions and retirement savings. And the ratepayers paid. Electricity rates in Washington rose 300% during the 1980s to cover the debt. The taxpayers paid too, because federal agencies owned some of the bonds. When a private billionaire builds a monument to their own ambition and it fails, their family absorbs the loss. But WPPS was built with public money. When it failed, the public absorbed the loss. And that's the difference between private folly and a public tragedy. In July 1983, the music stopped. The Washington Public Power Supply System, or WPPSS, defaulted on its bonds. Suddenly, $2.25 billion in bonds became worthless overnight. It was the largest municipal bond default in American history, and that record still stands today. The fallout was immediate. Investors sued. Utilities sued each other. Ratepayers sued the utilities. The legal battles dragged on for more than a decade. Finally, Washington's Supreme Court delivered a stunning verdict. The take-or-pay contracts that underpinned the whole project were invalid. Utilities had no legal obligation to pay for power plants that were never going to be built. The people who lost were the bondholders, pension funds, retirees, and everyday small investors who had been told municipal bonds were the safest investment you could make. One retired teacher who had invested her entire pension said in court, "They told us it was safe." They promised. The judge had no answer for her. With the collapse of plants 4 and 5, the entire project unraveled. Construction on plants 1 and 3 was also terminated. 3 massive nuclear plants, dead on the vine. Billions of dollars spent with absolutely nothing to show for it. Only one plant, WNP2, managed to survive. It finally came online in 1984, 7 years late, and at triple its original budget. To escape the toxic reputation of the project, it was quickly renamed the Columbia Generating Station. It operates to this day as Washington's only nuclear power plant. 1 reactor, out of a planned 5. At the abandoned sites, the structures still stand like skeletal remains of a forgotten giant. Cooling towers rise into the sky, empty and silent. Reactor buildings are sealed tombs, their concrete walls entombing a dream that died. Rebar rusts in the dry desert air, sticking out of foundations that will never support anything. For years, security guards patrolled the empty grounds, keeping out vandals and preventing kids from trying to climb the massive towers. They were maintaining the fiction that maybe someday if energy demand came roaring back, construction could resume. It never did. Federal investigators eventually launched a massive audit to figure out what went so disastrously wrong. The final report was thousands of pages long, but the summary painted a picture of total systemic failure. First, there was a failure of management. WPPSS wasn't a single entity with clear leadership. It was a consortium of 88 different utilities, all voting on every single decision. It was chaos disguised as democracy. Then, there was a failure of forecasting. The wild predictions of endless energy demand were based on faulty assumptions. They ignored the potential for conservation, the impact of recessions, and the decline of heavy industry. The philosophy was predict and provide, build it and they will come, instead of a more cautious wait-and-see approach. There were regulatory failures too. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission kept changing the rules mid-construction, without any regard for how these changes would impact the cost or the schedule. There were engineering failures. Trying to build 5 complex nuclear reactors all at the same time meant that lessons learned at one site couldn't be applied to the others in time to prevent the same mistakes from being made over and over. And finally, a massive financial failure. The very nature of municipal bonds created a perverse incentive to borrow staggering amounts of money with the idea that the bill would come due much later. But later never came. The report didn't name any villains. No one went to jail. No executives were criminally charged. This wasn't a story of fraud. It was a story of hubris. It was a story of a system so flawed that everyone involved could make what they thought were rational decisions, and still end up creating an absolute catastrophe. So, who paid the price for this hubris? The workers paid. Thousands of jobs vanished overnight. Careers ended. Entire communities built around the project were destroyed. The bondholders paid. Their pensions evaporated. Their retirement savings, which they thought were secure, turned into worthless paper. The ratepayers paid. Electricity rates in Washington state skyrocketed by 300% during the 1980s. Just to service the debt on the one surviving plant and pay for all the lawsuits. And the taxpayers paid. Because federal agencies also owned some of the bonds, the losses were ultimately covered by public funds. Think about it this way. When George Vanderbilt built his lavish Biltmore estate with his own private money and the project was a financial failure, his family absorbed the loss. But WPPS was built with public money. So when it failed, the public absorbed the loss. That's the fundamental difference between a private folly and a public tragedy. The WPPS's disaster did more than just bankrupt investors. It killed the future of nuclear power in the United States for an entire generation. After 1983, not a single new nuclear plant was ordered in America until 2007. The entire industry was frozen solid. And it wasn't just because of the accident at 3 Mile Island. It was because of WPPSS. WPPSS proved that a nuclear project could devastate communities even without a meltdown. The financial radiation from this default lasted far longer than any physical radiation ever could. Other nuclear plants that were already under construction around the country were canceled. Investors fled the nuclear sector entirely, and utilities quickly pivoted to cheaper, more flexible natural gas plants. The grand dream of a nuclear-powered America, an age of clean, limitless energy, died right there in the deserts of eastern Washington. What's so tragic is what could have been. If WPPS had just taken a more measured approach, building one reactor at a time, things could have been completely different. They could have brought WNP2 online on schedule and on budget back in 1977. Then, if demand grew as predicted, they could have started on WNP1, if it kept growing. Instead, they bet everything on a single wildly optimistic forecast. And when that forecast failed, the entire enterprise collapsed. This is a pattern we see again and again. Just miles away, the Hanford site had successfully built massive nuclear facilities in stages over decades. It worked. The irony is that the people in the Tri-Cities knew how to execute large-scale nuclear projects. They'd lived next to Hanford for 40 years. But somehow they forgot the most important lesson. You can't rush atoms. Starting in the 1990s, WPPSS, now renamed Energy Northwest, began the long and costly process of decommissioning the abandoned plants. It's a process expected to take 60 years and cost over $1 billion. Decommissioning means removing any residual radioactive material, which is minimal since the reactors never operated. It means draining all the systems, sealing the containment buildings, and then monitoring the sites for decades. Eventually, someday, the structures will be demolished. Plants 4 and 5 are simpler cases as they never got far enough to become radioactive. They're just giant abandoned construction sites. But you can't just bulldoze a half-built nuclear plant. The concrete is too thick. The structure's too massive. The cost of demolition is almost as much as the cost of construction, so they stand there. They are monuments to an ambition that burned too brightly, a warning from the past about the dangers of unchecked optimism. They are a silent testament to the largest municipal bond default in American history, a story of failure on a scale that is truly hard to comprehend. What if I told you the story of the biggest municipal bond default in American history? A story of ambition so grand, it nearly bankrupted an entire region. This isn't just about concrete and steel. It's about shattered dreams and lessons learned the hard way. This is the story of the Washington Public Power Supply System, or WPPSS, and its catastrophic failure to build 5 nuclear power plants. Back in the early 1970s, the Pacific Northwest was booming. Energy forecasters looked at the charts and saw a future of skyrocketing demand. The solution? A massive, audacious plan to build a fleet of nuclear power plants. It was sold as the key to a prosperous future, a clean, reliable energy source for generations to come. 88 public utilities across the region signed on, and WPPSS, a consortium of these utilities, raised billions of dollars by selling municipal bonds. They promised investors a safe, reliable return, and they promised ratepayers cheap, abundant power. It was a project born of pure American optimism. What could possibly go wrong? The dream quickly turned into a logistical nightmare. Imagine trying to coordinate the construction of 5 massive, complex nuclear reactors at once. The scale was unprecedented. Costs began to spiral out of control almost immediately. Inflation was rampant in the 70s and interest rates were soaring. Construction delays plagued every site. A 1-year delay could add hundreds of millions to the budget. The initial cost estimate of $4 billion ballooned to a staggering $24 billion. The project became a black hole for money, sucking in capital with no end in sight. At the same time, the very foundation of the project started to crumble. Those confident energy demand forecasts? They were wrong, dead wrong. A regional recession hit, conservation efforts took hold, and the predicted energy crisis never materialized. Suddenly, the Northwest didn't need all this new power. The public, once supportive, grew skeptical. The 3 Mile Island accident in 1979 stoked fears about nuclear safety, turning public opinion decidedly against the project. Protests erupted. People chained themselves to the gates. The project was no longer a symbol of progress. It was a symbol of government waste and hubris. By the early 1980s, the writing was on the wall. WPPSS was hemorrhaging money. In 1982, facing an impossible financial situation, they made a historic decision. They terminated 2 of the plants, WNP4 and WNP-5. These were the 2 plants backed by the 88 smaller utilities. The problem was, under the contracts, these utilities had to pay for the plants whether they produced a single watt of electricity or not. They were on the hook for billions of dollars for 2 giant concrete shells that would never be finished. The utilities refused to pay, leading to a cascade of lawsuits. The climax came on July 25, 1983. WPPSS defaulted on $2.25 billion in bonds. It was the largest municipal bond default in U.S. history at the time. Thousands of investors, many of them retirees who had put their life savings into what they thought were ultra-safe government bonds, were wiped out overnight. The fallout was immense. The nickname WPPSS became a punchline, mockingly pronounced whoops. It was a financial disaster that reverberated across the country, shaking faith in public projects and municipal bonds for years. So, what happened to the 5 plants? Well, out of the entire ambitious fleet, only 1 was ever completed. WNP2, now known as the Columbia Generating Station, finally went online in 1984, years behind schedule and billions over budget. The other 4 became modern ruins. Construction on WNP1 and WNP3 was halted when they were about 60% and 75% complete, respectively. For decades, their massive unfinished cooling towers stood silent over the Washington landscape, monuments to a failed dream. WNP-4 and WNP-5 were barely started before being canceled, their sites now empty fields. But the story doesn't end there. The one plant that was finished, Columbia Generating Station, is a success story, kind of. It reliably generates about 10% of Washington's electricity and employs over 1,000 people. It runs safely, with no major incidents. But it's also the most expensive power plant in the Northwest. The electricity it produces costs 3 times as much as the region's abundant hydropower. Why? Because the debt from its construction, $3.2 billion back in 1984, is still being paid off. Ratepayers are still subsidizing it to this day, paying for a decision made before many of them were born. The plant will run until at least 2043. Financially, it will probably never break even. The debt is just too big. So who really paid the price for this grand ambition? The workers who lost their jobs when the project shut down, the bondholders who lost their savings, and the ratepayers who are still footing the bill. But the biggest cost might have been trust. Trust in public utilities, trust in expert forecasts, and trust in grand plans. The Whoops disaster made Americans deeply skeptical of megaprojects. It taught us to ask tough questions. Prove it works small before you build it big. Show me the demand before you build the supply. That skepticism has its own costs. Maybe we become too cautious, too afraid to build the next Hoover Dam or Golden Gate Bridge. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. Ambition, if it burns too bright and ignores the warning signs, can destroy you. The cooling towers that once stood in the desert were more than just ruins. They were warnings. They were a uniquely American story of ambition, scale, failure, and a lesson learned far too late. If you re-fascinated by these deep dives into America's abandoned megaprojects and the human stories behind them, hit that like button and subscribe. I want to know what we should explore next. The abandoned superconducting supercollider in Texas? The canceled expeditionary fighting vehicle? Or maybe there's a forgotten megaproject in your backyard with a story that needs to be told. Let me know in the comments. Every one of these projects has its shadows and every dream has its price. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.